She was thrown out to die, but her baby walked into the world stage. The nurse didn't even look up when the woman screamed. Her cries echoed down the hospital corridor, bouncing off cracked tiles and faded posters that promised compassionate care for all. But compassion was not free in Ouagadougou's private wards, especially not for a woman like her, barefoot, skin crusted in red dust, belly still heavy with pain, and a newborn wrapped in nothing but a torn scarf. She had come here because the state hospital had no power, no beds, no medicine. Her child had come too early, gasping in air like it was a battle. And for a few hours this mother believed she had found safety. But when the staff learned she couldn't pay, their faces hardened. They unplugged the incubator, and then they dragged her. By the arm, the child clutched to her chest, a trail of blood smearing the floor behind her. No one stopped them. Not the receptionist counting coins. Not the guard leaning on his rifle. Not even the patients watching from behind flimsy curtains. This was not a hospital. It was a place where the poor came to bleed quietly. But someone had seen it. Outside the gates, leaning on a worn wooden cane and a cloak soaked from dust storms, a quiet figure watched the scene. No cameras, no escort, no title, just a pair of eyes hardened by war, softened by memory. It was President Ibrahim Traoré. He had come unannounced, walking alone through the city before dawn, to see his country through its wounds, not its windows, and now he saw everything. In the hours that followed, the hospital director would insist it was a misunderstanding. The Minister of Health would call for a review of ethical procedures. But Traoré didn't speak. He simply followed the trail of blood through the gates, past the guards, down the hallway that now smelled of antiseptic and silence. The woman, her name was Nasira, had collapsed under a jacaranda tree near the hospital's side exit, her baby pressed against her ribs, lips purple from the cold. She was barely conscious when Traoré reached her. His hands trembled as he checked the infant's pulse. Weak. But there, still fighting. The guards who had thrown her out now watched, frozen, as their president, their commander, lifted the baby in his arms. Not for show, not for news, but because it reminded him of his own mother. A woman who had once sold mangoes in the market just to afford antibiotics for her son. Later that morning, the hospital was surrounded, not by soldiers, but by mothers. Dozens of women came with babies strapped to their backs, chanting not slogans, but stories. They spoke of lost sons, untreated fevers, nurses who turned them away with smiles. Some wept. Others simply stood with fists closed around empty prescription slips. By noon, the hospital's license had been revoked. Not by legal notice, but by order from the president himself. The board members were summoned, their foreign backers exposed, their offshore accounts investigated. What they called private enterprise, Traoré called national betrayal. But it didn't stop there. Traoré returned to the same hospital that evening, this time in full uniform, flanked by a single camera crew. And in a short, grave announcement broadcast across the country, he said, "Any institution that profits from the suffering of our mothers is no longer welcome on Burkinabe soil." That night, the power flickered. In clinics across the country, officials scrambled, NGOs went silent, foreign investors whispered about instability. But the people lit candles. For the first time, the poor believed that someone was watching. Not from above, but from beside them. Burkina Faso didn't sleep that night. From the dusty hills of Kaya to the storm-broken rooftops of Bobo Dioulasso, radios crackled in tea stalls, under mosquito nets, and outside village clinics. The voice of President Ibrahim Traoré, measured, firm, and wounded, had touched a place deeper than politics. It had awakened memory. Women who had buried children without names remembered. Men who had watched their wives die in waiting rooms wept openly in silence. In the capital, even those who once doubted him stood still in the streets, eyes locked on public screens. No slogans, no celebration, just reverence. And far from the public eye, in the charred corridors of power, whispers began to rise. The hospital that dragged Nasira had not acted alone. It was one of 5 privately funded partners backed by foreign development agencies, organizations that dressed like charities but negotiated like oil barons. In exchange for modern facilities and clean branding, they demanded operational freedom, which meant turn away the poor, serve only the profitable. Traore had signed none of those deals. They were old agreements, passed quietly under previous regimes, masked as healthcare upgrades. But now, someone had disrupted their silence. The embassy calls began the next morning. Diplomats urged caution. Economic partnerships are delicate. One emotional incident must not jeopardize national stability. Reputation matters in international finance. But Traore didn't reply. Instead, he walked into the National Archives. He opened every file tied to foreign health contracts, mining deals, military agreements, documents that no living citizen had ever seen. Most had no translation. Some had forged signatures. All shared a single sickness, the assumption that Africa's poor were invisible. He copied them, digitized them, released them. No press release, just links, posted at midnight from an anonymous government page spreading across WhatsApp groups like wild honey. By dawn, the country knew names, companies, bribes, offshore beneficiaries. The narrative had changed. This wasn't just about Nasira anymore. This was about every mother who had been turned away. Nasira, meanwhile, was recovering in a small rural clinic, one not owned by private interests, but by the hands of the community. Her baby, whom she had named Suleiman, now breathed softly in a repurposed incubator powered by solar panels donated by students from Kudugu Polytechnic. When asked if she understood what had happened, Nasira said only one thing. "I thought my child would die alone, but someone important chose to kneel." That line became a whisper across the nation. He knelt. In African history, leaders are often remembered for what they built. Traore now was being remembered for what he refused to step over, but not everyone celebrated. Western media outlets began running subtle smear pieces. Traore's populist theatrics raised concern. Authoritarian undertones in recent policy shakeups. Burkina Faso's unpredictable young leader jeopardizes donor confidence. They didn't mention Nasira. They didn't mention Suleiman. They mentioned numbers, investments, losses. In boardrooms across the Atlantic, lobbyists demanded action. "He's turning the public against us. We need a media strategy. Is he still manageable?" And then came the proposal. Cut the aid, start with medical shipments, reduce funding to local clinics, pressure regional governments, make the people feel the cost of defiance. It was a familiar tactic, but Traore had anticipated it. Before they could act, he called a summit, not in a hotel, not in a capital, but in a village field beneath a tree. He invited mothers, nurses, healers, midwives, village elders, and a few foreign reporters, those brave enough to walk barefoot to the truth. And there he announced the Sovereign Health Project, a national initiative to replace foreign-funded clinics with community-run medical centers, training local midwives, equipping youth with mobile medical kits, building from the ground, not the sky. The crowd did not cheer. They nodded. They stood, because promises had been made before. But this time, the blood had been seen, and it had not been ignored. The pressure came like a wave, not all at once but steady, deliberate, and suffocating. Within a week of Traore's public denouncement of foreign health contractors, 3 major pharmaceutical shipments were delayed. Customs agents in neighboring countries were unable to verify paperwork. Aid representatives began canceling meetings. Ambassadors, once polite, now offered stiff smiles and vague condolences. The hospitals in the cities felt it first. No insulin, no antibiotics. Clinics began rationing supplies. People whispered, "Is this the price of pride?" But in the villages, something else was happening. In a remote province called Zondoma, a group of schoolgirls turned their sewing classes into gauze-making workshops. In the dry hills of Fadangurma, Retired herbalists reopened ancient medicine houses, offering healing with roots, prayers, and ancestral touch. And in Dedugu, children formed human chains to transport donated medicine from border villages, back to clinics still functioning. It wasn't organized, it wasn't pretty, but it was real. And for the first time, the country's heartbeat didn't come from supply chains or satellite dishes. It came from barefoot steps on red soil. President Traore refused to beg. He watched quietly as foreign news anchors asked, "Is he letting his people suffer?" But those same anchors had never shown the faces of mothers like Nasira. They had never filmed the dirt floors where Burkinabe babies were born. He didn't need their sympathy. He needed time, because something deeper was taking root. His sovereign health project, once mocked, had become the blueprint for a new era. Nurses trained on solar-powered tablets. Emergency lines operated on peer-to-peer networks, bypassing state infrastructure. Community-owned blood banks were forming from voluntary donations under tree canopies. No logos, no Western flags, just hands, hope, and memory. But the West was watching. Behind diplomatic curtains, a more aggressive plan was forming. Make him look unstable. Undermine his legitimacy. Support opposition figures in civil unrest. Within days, student protests erupted in 2 major cities. Organized through anonymous accounts, signs held high. "We need medicine, not speeches." Some carried real pain. Others, cash. In one protest, a student named Salif, barely 20, threw a stone at a government building. He was arrested. A video of the arrest went viral, edited to show only his screaming, not the burning of ambulances that preceded it. Traore knew what this was. Not a protest, a provocation. But instead of ordering a crackdown, he did something no president had ever done. He visited the jail himself, alone. He walked into the holding room, stood before the students, and said nothing. Just stood. The silence grew heavy. Some bowed their heads, others trembled, and one, Salif himself, began to weep. When he was later asked why, he simply said, "Because he didn't hit me back. He just looked at me like I was his son." That look, more than any law, more than any speech, began to shift the tide. Traore returned to the palace, and the footage of his visit was leaked, not by officials, but by one of the students themselves. Within hours, the hashtags changed. He knelt. He looked. He listened. And in the silence that followed, the people began to ask a new question. What kind of power doesn't protect itself with violence but with vision? The answer was whispered in street corners, schoolyards, and hospital wards. Still holding on. And for the first time in generations, they didn't feel ruled. They felt seen. They came with papers this time, not bullets. A quiet, diplomatic convoy arrived in the capital at dawn. Clean cars, crisp suits, soft threats wrapped in friendly phrases. The message was clear. Reverse your health reforms, reinstate foreign contracts, and the aid will return. No one had to suffer. No one had to starve. It was an old offer, wrapped in new paper. And Traore had read this script before. He took the papers, read them silently, then handed them back without a word. The convoy left without a handshake. That same night, a journalist in Paris released a leak. Emails between aid agencies, embassy staff, and pharmaceutical executives. Their contents exposed a quiet plot. Cut off Burkina Faso supplies to pressure regime change through internal exhaustion. They called it strategic soft collapse. The world gasped, but the country did not. They already knew. Traore appeared on national radio, not television, not Twitter, just radio, where even the oldest grandmothers and most distant herders could hear. His voice was tired but strong. If being independent means losing what they give, let it be lost. If dignity costs us comfort, let us be uncomfortable together. And if the world calls it madness, then let madness be our freedom. The next morning, the streets of Ouagadougou were not filled with protesters or police. They were filled with mothers, thousands of them, wrapped in cotton and sweat, carrying their babies, holding signs not of anger but of protection. Not again. We remember Nasira. Don't touch our future. They didn't shout. They just stood. Across villages, men returned from fields early to join them. Elders came barefoot. Midwives closed their clinics just for 1 hour to walk in solidarity. It was no longer about Traore. It was about them. About every mother dragged, every child lost, every wound ignored in the name of stability. And then, from the same hospital where Nasira had once been thrown out, a nurse came forward on camera. Her voice trembled. She held a single photograph of the baby Soleimani, now healthy, wrapped in cloth, asleep in his mother's arms. We failed her. But she was not forgotten. The footage reached international newsrooms. It broke algorithms. The narrative collapsed. The world could no longer deny what had happened, not because a president had spoken, but because a nation had stood. In the months that followed, change became more than a slogan. New community clinics rose, not marble towers, but solar huts with trained staff paid by national funds. The Sovereign Health Project expanded to 5 regions. Student nurses graduated with pride. Local pharmaceutical labs were funded by diaspora donations. Burkina Faso didn't become rich, but it became ready. And as for Nasira, she now taught prenatal care at a rural center. She never asked for attention, never spoke of the day she was dragged. But when people looked at her child, they said, "He is the boy who reminded us what a president should do." And Traore? He never celebrated. He simply worked. Because the real power was never in his office. It was in the silent vow he made the day he lifted that child from the ground. No mother will ever bleed on my soil without being seen again. The world tried to move on. Another conflict, another election, another financial summit. But the image of Soleimani, Nasira's baby wrapped in white cloth blinking beneath a straw ceiling, kept returning in timelines, documentaries, and embassy halls. Not as a symbol of poverty, but of resistance. In Geneva, global health leaders debated whether Traore's reforms were sustainable. They cited spreadsheets, GDP forecasts, corruption indexes. But behind closed doors, they whispered something else. What if the people start asking for more? Because something terrifying had happened. For them, at least. A poor woman had survived without foreign permission. A nation had built clinics without global contracts. A president had refused funding and grown more beloved because of it. Western analysts scrambled. The phrase Burkina syndrome began appearing in policy memos, a rising phenomenon where former colonies rejected aid strings, embraced local systems, and survived. Traore hadn't started a rebellion. He had triggered a new template. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, something far more profound was unfolding. At a dusty primary school in Kupela, a 12-year-old girl named Aissata stood up in class and said she wanted to become a nurse like Nasira. No one laughed. The teacher nodded slowly and wrote the name on the chalkboard. A quiet revolution was crawling through the soil, not in fire, but in dreams. Soleimani, now smiling, could be seen in the arms of doctors during mobile health campaigns. His image was printed on vaccine boxes labeled Made in Faso. His mother, still humble, had become a guide for expectant women. She refused to take a salary. "I've been paid already," she would say, eyes lingering on her son. But it wasn't just inspiration Traore was fighting for. It was defense. In the shadows, destabilization attempts increased. A shipment of malaria drugs was intercepted at the border, deliberately tainted. Intelligence units uncovered coordinated disinformation campaigns, memes mocking Traore as a dictator, voiceover clips using AI to distort his speeches. Worse, foreign-backed politicians began to rise from within his cabinet. Former allies now questioned his unilateral decisions. The language of betrayal returned, elegant, patient, camouflaged. But Traore knew the scent. He had smelled it in uniforms. Now it came in suits. Instead of fighting them with arrests or public trials, he did something quieter. He walked from region to region, from village to village, listening, sleeping under tin roofs, eating street food with his fingers. No motorcades, no briefings, just presence. And wherever he went, people said the same thing. He doesn't rule. He walks with us. 6 months later, the African Union hosted a high-level emergency health summit. The agenda was framed politely, strengthening health security in West Africa. But everyone knew it was about Traore. Would he attend? Would he confront the West on a global stage? Would he finally bend? Delegations arrived in suits and sarcasm. They expected a fight. What they didn't expect was Nasira. She walked into the conference hall wearing a simple white dress, her child balanced on her hip, flanked by Burkinabe health workers, not guards. Silence fell. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply walked to the center, placed her child in a small woven basket beside the podium, and stepped back. Then Traore entered. He didn't speak like a leader. He spoke like a son. This child was born into a system designed to ignore him. But he did not die. He lived. And because he lived, something else did too. Our dignity. He paused, then added, "If your systems are threatened by a baby who survived, perhaps the problem is not our resistance, but your design." The hall remained silent. The speech spread like wildfire. Headlines couldn't spin it. Commentators could only gasp. No promises were made. No deals were signed. But when the summit ended, 5 nations quietly asked for help to replicate Traore's model. Back home, the people didn't dance. They didn't throw parades. They simply returned to work, with more pride, more strength, and more ownership than ever before. And in one small rural clinic, Nasira's baby took his first unassisted steps, across the same floor where other children once died waiting for approval. A mother watched, a nation remembered, and a president kept walking.